You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to ADHD BCE, the podcast scouring the ages in search of neurodiversity. I'm your host George Lomas and I have ADHD, autism and a fascination with ancient things. In the last episode, we took the idea of neurodiversity beyond the world of anatomically modern humans, as in us, and into the enigmatic world of Neanderthals with Dr Andy Shuttleworth, who is an honorary fellow at the Department of Anthropology at Durham University and a veritable Neanderthal nerd. I spoke in length to Andy about Neanderthals and if we could see any signs of spectrum traits like creativity, ingenuity, stone collecting, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, we kind of ran out of time, but I'm delighted to welcome Andy back today to continue our chat about Neanderthals. Andy, welcome back.
Thank you for having me, George. Hello.
Hi, great. So, Andy, we need to pick up from where we were in the last episode, and we were just starting to touch on symbolism and social structures among our nearest and dearest Neanderthals. Mm-hmm. But before we dive into that, there's a burning question I've been carrying around since we last spoke. So, in the last episode, we touched on the possibility that there's been a genetic gift of some elements of autism from Neanderthals. And I think that's right. And I can't get it out of my head. If we inherited that particular gene from them, did they inherit that from earlier species like Heidelbergensis or Erectus?
Possible. Very possible. Not going to say yes or no either way because the genetic analysis hasn't been done and I don't want to kind of put, all the chickens in a line before we've got the evidence. But there's one of two main kind of things why those genes would be prevalent. Those kind of neurodiversity associated genes might be present within our own genome. One is, like you said, we've inherited it from Neanderthals who have inherited it from maybe an older shared common ancestor, Heidelbergensis, Antecessor, Erectus, Ergaster, whomever. And because of that shared ancestorship, we get it from both the Neanderthals and our shared ancestor. That's why we have it in the majority of our, Homo sapien populations in the modern day. So that's one reason, like you've said, it could have come from a shared ancestor and therefore just been propagated by the Neanderthals, come back into us in some way, shape or form, had a boost. And that's why you see it in most modern populations today. The second reason why it could be so diverse within modern contemporary populations of Homo sapiens is that they were selectively chosen, so that those genes could have had a positive effect for those Homo sapiens. So remember last time we checked, the only reason that those genes would be so prevalent is one of two reasons. One, they were evolutionarily or advantageously neutral, so they had no negative, no positive kind of impact to our genome, so they were just kept. Or the second option is that they were positively influenced for our genome, so they had a net positive to our behavior, our genetic code in some way. So the second reason is they could have been positive, and that's why they were selected for, and that's why they're prevalent in so many contemporary modern human societies. Once they're in the genes, whether they came from an ancestor or the Neanderthals directly, they were positive, they were selected for evolutionarily, and then they just spread through all contemporary Homo sapien populations through breeding between different communities, etc., etc. So there are the two reasons why we would see them so distributed across not just Eurasia, but a little bit in Africa, North America, that kind of thing. Going forward, they're either a result of a common ancestor or they came from Neanderthals and they were positively selected and were therefore spread across our species.
Yeah, you see, I always knew that autism was a positive thing. It's bound to.
Well, that's the thing, really. Any behaviour has a positive kind of spin to it, right? There's no. Well, I don't want to dig myself into a hole, but there's no really bad behavior. You just need the context of that behavior for it to be positive. You need the context to that behavior to be right. And that right behavior could be right for an entire community or an entire species, or it could be right for like a familial unit or an individual, say, that kind of thing. So you have behaviors such as, say, in hunter-gatherers who take more than they contributed to hunts and stuff like that, right? And they're just like, okay, I've not really contributed to this hunting of a bison or hunting of a reindeer, hunting of a moose or whatever, but I'm going to take more than is due me. And that kind of behavior ensures that their genes they survive, their genes are spread to the next generation, etc. And it's detrimental a little bit to the overall familial or community unit, but it's beneficial for that individual because that individual survives. Context is key for behavior. So, broadly, there might not be any negative bad behaviors, but there might be negative bad contexts where those behaviors can express themselves. But that's the joy of human societies. We create these social structures that kind of elevate those certain contexts and thus the good behaviors with them, and create certain social rules which diminish the certain contexts and certain negative behaviors that could be negative for the whole group.
Yeah, I think we can see evidence of that in the modern world that we live in. A lot of that goes on. We have that in hunter-gatherers as well, right? So you have like Indigenous Americans, you have the various kind of Arctic Inuit, Northern Canadian kind of hunter-gatherers, that kind of stuff. You even have the tropical hunter-gatherers like the Kuka and various South African kind of communities and hunter-gatherers who all have various kind of social control mechanisms to do it. We in our modern society have laws, have punishments, right? You can go to jail, you can be fined, you can be socially shunned, whatever. The hunter-gatherers have their own type of rules. My favorite is the Inuit, who have like this gossip system network amongst them. So if someone breaks a social rule, then the women of the group will gossip about them, and that gossip will then get filtered through, and that's like a communication network to say, hey, this individual has broken a rule and that's bad, and that person is then shamed into following the rules again. And I find that a very good social control mechanism. It's one of those things where it's like, that's amazing. I also imagine it as like my grandmother and her friends like gossiping over knitting and stuff like that, and just like, oh well, Steve has done this and that kind of thing, and it eventually gets to Steve's mom, who puts Steve in his place, and Steve becomes better, that kind of stuff. But yeah, there are those macrocosms of hunter-gatherer behavior and social control that are also available in our modern society. Yeah, sure. And it's a bit like a shame-based motivation, isn't it? But it's probably a bit more ethical than I don't know, some of the punishments that if you look at sort of Victorian England or whatever, when they just threw you stole a loaf of bread, you got carted off to the sunniest place in the world.
It's more ethical than forced relocation. Though banishment for hunter-gatherer societies was a punishment. Like if an individual didn't take heed of that shame, or didn't take heed of the other public social control mechanisms that community had in place, then banishment was a thing. That is very evident in Native and Indigenous American groups.
Well, I can imagine as well. I mean, I've seen enough survival programs these days to know that being part of the group is essential, especially in a what we call it, a Jumanji type world, didn't we? If you imagine you've been isolated out there in a hostile environment, potentially very difficult environments anyway, the weather and climate and the predators and so on. You literally, if you get kicked out, you haven't got long. You've got to take so if you don't want to be gossiped about, that's one thing. But if you say don't care what people say about you in those environments, that might not work too well. If you get kicked out on your ear and you're sort of left to fend for yourself, and you've probably got weeks left to live. I don't know. Exactly.
Yeah, you to be banished, and if you can't find another community with like shared, worldviews or shared kind of traits to your original community, then you're on your own, and death is significantly likely. And that's why cooperation within hunter-gatherers is so key, because there's that recognition that they all have to work together, because individuals make a community, and individuals sometimes are fallible, but working together, communicating, sharing, that kind of thing, the ceremonies and rituals that bind these individuals together allows for success.
Well, that is probably the perfect way to sort of cover it into the next question that I've got for you, actually, Andy, which is, what would it have looked like, or if that's stretching their imaginations a little bit too far, how could it have looked, smelt, felt, and been to have been a Neanderthal at various times and places? And if we can go one step further and imagine that DeLorean we mentioned in the last episode, if that came and flew us back hundreds of thousands of years, what would it have been like to have been a neurodivergent Neanderthal? But I suppose, as well, to be fair, before we go too far into that, we should probably look at the structures and symbolism within the groups and sort of build from that, if you like.
Yeah, let's talk about I'll mention the social structures and the symbolism of Neanderthals, because they were symbolic and they did have distinct social structures, and that could give you an idea and give your listeners here an idea of how the Neanderthals lived and what they experienced, that going forward, and then we can focus on hypothesizing about the neurodivergence within the Neanderthal behavior and stuff. First thing to mention is when we talk about kind of Neanderthals and their population, we're not talking about our contemporary numbers. So obviously Homo sapiens today inhabit most ecosystems across this world. There are 7 to 8 billion of us on this planet. We'll take it to your listeners whether you view that number as too large or too small or just right. We're not looking at those numbers with Neanderthals in Europe or Eurasia. Okay, we're talking about the thousands, the tens of thousands. I think around 70,000 is the number at any one given time, maybe at their peak, that the number of Neanderthals were. So to put that in context, that's probably a large town in the UK. That's the number of students from 3 universities in the UK, 70,000, all distributed across that geography we talked about, Eurasia, from Iberia up to middle England, down to Italy, all the way to the Near East, to modern day Israel, for example, to Georgia, and all the way going into to modern day China, Mongolia, Siberia, that kind of thing. 70,000 distributed that far. 3 universities worth of students, a large English town. That's not a lot. So their social structure is heavily distributed. It's distributed across all of that area. Okay, so it's not like they're in constant touch with the Neanderthals, next door but one to them. They have these large spaces where they rove, where they hunter-gather, where they hunt, that kind of stuff. And it could be months, it could be years before they interact with another Neanderthal group. They could very likely have seasonal cycles, seasonal areas of where they hunt and seasonal places where they go to gather, that kind of thing. And through that seasonality and that regular kind of pattern, they would come into contact with more of their kin, that kind of stuff. But we're looking at these small groups, highly dispersed, that have between maybe 10 and 30 individuals within a familial group. Okay, right. So not much, enough that they can acquire food, enough that they can teach and learn and maybe support little Neanderthal children as they grow up and stuff like that. So you look at Cueva de Silva in Spain and the footprints for La Roselle in France. So Cueva de Silva in Spain, you have about 7 adults, 3 adolescents, 2 juveniles and an infant, okay, within that kind of group. Whereas in La Roselle in France, based on footprint size, you have about 10 to 30 members of Neanderthals there in that particular group, where there are juveniles and adolescents, which made up 90% of the group. And that's the thing with Neanderthals. You're not living to the ripe old age of 80. You're probably dying in what we would call early middle age. So, 30 to 40 kind of thing. Not necessarily because of bad health, probably because of the activity that they are involved in.
Yeah, it's a bit like a rugby player's career sort of comes to the end. Yeah. By the time you're in your 30s, your body's just battered and bruised and you can't really move around it. And I suppose in a lot of the environments we talked about over the last few 100,000 years, you need to be able to move. That's one of the first things you need to be able to do. Migration
is key. Migration is the key behavior to adaptation to a changing environment, especially in the middle Paleolithic of that time. And like say, you have your modern day football players, that's your Homo sapiens. They run about, they get exhausted, but they can hunt from a distance. They're persistent hunters. They will injure an animal and they will chase it down until that animal is exhausted, and then they will butcher it and hunt it and gather the meat from it. Neanderthals are different. They're quite possibly close quarters hunters. And when you consider what they're hunting, which could be, saber-toothed cat, large bison, mammoth, those creatures aren't going to take that lightly. Okay, you go to up a mammoth with 5 or 6 of your fellow Neanderthal rugby league players to hunt it with your sticks and your stone tools and your spears and everything like that. That mammoth could do some significant damage if it suddenly wants to turn around and say, I do not want to be your burger tonight, that kind of thing. Of course, there are evidence that Neanderthals also used very intricate kind of behaviors to hunt animals such as mammoths. So at Le Cotte, for example, there's the old theory that they used that site in Jersey to kind of herd mammoth down into a gully so that they would fall down into a gully and be killed through the fall, that kind of thing. So that, precludes them getting up close and personal with these kinds of creatures. But in other areas, there's distinct evidence, bone breakings, pathology of Neanderthals, where it shows the heavy life that they're living. So they're not living to 80, they probably were living to 30 or 40. So it makes sense that, like Lorenz France indicates, that about 90% maybe of their groups are juveniles and adolescents, growing up quicker and faster and having to learn and live, that kind of thing going through. As for the overall kind of dynamics going through, what we're looking at is probably the same as any hunter-gatherer, whether that be contemporary, whether that be prehistoric, Homo sapiens, or even Neanderthals. They would, like you said, be living via migration. There would be a distribution of work. You would have expertise gathered towards hunting, expertise gathered towards gathering. I'm not saying that's gendered. In all likelihood, the Neanderthals probably wouldn't have had a gendered kind of society, because everyone needed to eat, and everyone needed to, put efforts into acquiring food in some way or shape or form. But there would have been those who would have stayed behind to look after children, the so-called, grandmother hypothesis of those who couldn't hunt, maybe. There were definitely those who were injured who were looked after whilst they were sick as well. So there was clearly some kind of community and group cohesion, suggesting that these 10 to 30 individuals in the normal size of Neanderthals are more likely familial units looking after their own. There would have had to have been teachers, whether that's everyone or specific people, to make those stone tools we were talking about. If you remember the Laval war tool, which isn't an easy concept to think visually, let alone learn, someone would have had to, some people would have had to teach, the little Neanderthal child and adolescent how to make that. So you would have had a system, a social structure, in many ways same as what we see in contemporary hunter-gatherer societies. For it's probably logical that that's one of the ways to survive. Everyone chips in, everyone learns from each other. People have expertise, individuals have expertise, and when that expertise comes off, they learn from that person and go forward. So yeah, it's one of those things where the groups would have been small, highly mobile, geared toward the acquisition of food and going towards better environments, geared towards maintaining maybe familial kin, and seasonally meeting up with other dispersed Neanderthal groups at certain points in time to maybe expand their kin networks.
Yeah, of course, because that absolutely has to happen. The genetic diversity is key for survival, I assume, in Neanderthals as much as it is in anatomically modern humans. I think I'm just imagining this world where there's 70,000 Neanderthals spaced out over half the globe in an enormous area. And obviously the conditions varied during ice ages and interglacials and all that lot. And it just blows my mind. I love this. I think about these tiny groups, because I appreciate that the populations are smaller, but it's not until you really sort of spend some time thinking about it that you start to imagine it. And that's when you see this little world, these tiny groups of Neanderthals in some of the most hostile environments imaginable. I mean, horrific to our sensibilities.
But those environments wouldn't have been all hostile all the time. So the information, that kind of picture I've showed you is probably more like the temperate times. So when the glacial period came in, what the archaeological record shows is that Neanderthals did group together in certain spots. So you have like Iberia, for example, where during glaciations you see a larger undertaking and settlement of Neanderthals. Same in the Middle East, for example, around modern-day Israel and Jordan and Lebanon. And obviously in France, where they just migrated south, they would have all kind of come together. So their societies would have ebbed and flowed and adapted according to the environment and the weather.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the image I've got of these small groups of, say, maybe as few as 10 members of a group that aren't... No, this is right, isn't it? They're not going to bump into any other groups of Neanderthals outside of those 10.
The core group might have been like 10 to 30 individuals. That could have been a core familial unit, for example, and then that they could have spent, let's hypothesize, 11 months of the year, just those 10 to 30 individuals. And then maybe 1 month, because of the cycle, because of the migration patterns, etc., they could have come across another Neanderthal group of 10 to 30 individuals, and that would have allowed mating, kin exchange, that kind of stuff to happen.
Absolutely, yeah. I just think about the logistics. It's a survival situation, isn't it? You can't just be blasé about it. You can't say, me and the guys fancy going hunting for a bit. We'll catch you guys later. There's got to be systems in place to ensure the safety of, because you have injuries. We know this. As a Neanderthal, there's been signs of injury on skeletal remains and so on. What about, I've lost my train of thought. ADHD again. Right, where was I, Andy? Come on, help me out.
Injuries.
Injuries. That was it. So if we look at people who are suffering, so we've got people with a disease, an illness, they're feeling under the weather, they ate the wrong thing, or they've been injured, or maybe they were born different. And maybe they weren't as mobile. Maybe they needed, or they were suited to better, different tasks. And maybe I have this vision is not the right word, is it? This image, of the small group operating in a particularly difficult environment where you've got a baby, you've got your grandfather who's in his 40s now, bless him, and you've got a couple of basically they're the hunters. We can't say that they were all male.
No. And in all likelihood, hunting would have been a mixed sex, mixed
family,
gender.
family. Family. I know myself and my wife, if we were thrown into Jumanji, we would obviously have 4 kids to take care of. So we'd have to ensure, first things first, we've got to stay alive. So we've got to protect the children, and we've got to get shelter from the weather and the predators and all that. And then we need water, and then we need food. So logistically, Neanderthals, it was second nature to them. That was their world. That's what they knew.
It's we go to Sainsbury's or whatever. They go out into the it's like, that's the thing. And there would have been lean days, lean weeks, maybe even lean months. So when they killed something, they would have stored it. So, a mammoth it's not going to feed one family of 10 to 30 for just a day for a meal. That will feed that 10 to 30 people. That will utilize everything from that mammoth to feed them for as long as possible, right? So they may dry out the food, they would use fire to cook it and stuff like that, and keep and preserve as much as possible. We're not just talking about the meat from it. The organs, the bones, the fats, the sinews would have all been used to support them, so that a mammoth could have supported 10 to 30 people, maybe for a week, 2 weeks, the better part of a month. So there would have been these like boom and bust periods going forward, and so the failure of a hunt could have, in all reality, could have signaled the death of these 10 to 30 individuals if it didn't go well.
Yeah, I was thinking about it. I felt a little emotional actually thinking about the smaller groups completely isolated, and then the weather turns and they haven't got those resources, and they're just going to die out, aren't they?
No, and this is one of the theories that go towards Neanderthal extinction, because you have those who say that modern humans and Neanderthals had this epic Paleolithic war and Homo sapiens won. I don't believe in that. That's not credible anymore. You have those who said Homo sapiens outbred Neanderthals, and there's some truth in that. That's likely possible, that we outcompeted them in resources and pushed them away from the hunts and the food sources. That is also possible, and there's some truth in that. But one of the other reasons is that the Neanderthals in such of these small groups were probably very close to extinction naturally, because all it takes is a downturn. All it takes is a failed hunt, and these individuals, these people are dead. So there's a theory of Neanderthal extinction that these small groups slowly reduced the genetic diversity, slowly reduced the total numbers of Neanderthal population below what we call, the breeding number, the effective population. Neanderthals, we estimate, needed at least 15,000 Neanderthal individuals to be breeding at any given one time to maintain the population. The loss of a group here, a group there, could be sustained. But if this is happening throughout Eurasia, are these small groups suddenly disappearing because a hunt fails, because the weather changes, because a glacier is there when it wasn't there before, because an individual dies without passing on their knowledge? If you're not looking at one or two small groups going, but dozens going, then that would effectively reduce the effective population size, which could put it under 15,000, which would mean that Neanderthals would not be able to sustain their numbers and genetic diversity. So there's this little theory says that actually the Neanderthals could have already been on the way to extinction as modern humans were coming in. We just sped that natural process up. So they were literally fighting for their lives. And if you believe that kind of theory, and there's some truth to it, they were already losing. Which is not to say that they were doomed to extinction, not to say that they weren't not smart enough or not comparable or anything. That's just nature. Because when last we spoke, we said the thing of like, there's this perception that because we survived, because we're the only human species here, that there's something better about us. Well, there's not really. We were just really lucky given the time of our evolution, given the nature of the interstadial events, the weather, the climate being nice and warm, that kind of thing, given the lack of competition between other major predators, which also includes some humans. We were just lucky. And the Neanderthals were lucky for a bit, until they weren't, and that's the way evolution works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just thinking as well, these isolated groups, when Homo sapiens turned up. Now, forgive me if I'm wrong on this, but I know the last glacial maximum was 20,000 odd years ago, wasn't it?
21,000, yeah.
21,000 years ago. Neanderthals died out at 40,000 years ago, and anatomically modern humans were in Europe by about 50,000. Was it 60? I can't remember what it was.
Give around 60,000 years. The dates, 50,000 to 60,000 years, the dates are fluctuating because, one, our dating is getting better and better and pushing back some dates, and two, we're finding new sites which also push back that kind of stuff.
Right. But good old archaeology.
Good old archaeology. So somewhere between 40 and 60,000 years is the general consensus that's when the first few significant waves of Homo sapiens started coming into Europe. Right.
Okay. So is it right to say that? So obviously, being of European descent myself, I'm almost certainly fortunate enough to have inherited, was it 2 to 6% Neanderthal DNA? So this interbreeding between Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans, that happened when the weather was good, essentially.
Yeah, pretty much. That would have happened when the interstadial's good. Homo sapiens were able to be like, hey, we can survive in this environment. We can adapt to this environment. Slightly.
Yeah, because it wasn't like we're in the middle of an ice age and we're all going to die out, and the Neanderthals came over and gave us a turkey or something.
There was a nice temperate atmosphere. There were forests, there were grasses. Southern Europe would have had probably a more warmer Mediterranean climate than it experiences now. There would have been tundra to the north. They would have been able to get to places where modern day Sheffield was, before they had any kind of issue, looking at Cresswell Crags and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's all, all of that was up. So it wasn't a major leap for Homo sapiens, for our populations to come into Europe at the time. Obviously, we had to adapt, different geography, different, species of flora and fauna, that kind of thing. There's also another human population there. So what you're probably likely is to have like 3 broad interbreeding contact zones. One in Eastern Europe, where we first meet, including maybe the Near East in modern day Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, that kind of thing. Probably the other major interbreeding zone is somewhere in central Western Europe, so Germany, France, that kind of area. And then the last interbreeding zone would have been around Iberia, where the last Neanderthals are dated, the latest Neanderthals are dated as they were pushed back kind of stuff. And the Neanderthals also would have interbreeded in their contact zones with other human species, because don't forget there are Denisovans at this point, and obviously, we share genes with those, Neanderthals, etc. So they would have been exchanging their genetic materials and stuff with them. So it's, all of those kind of things are happening. So it's not just this one big paleolithic party where everyone gets together and stuff like that. It's over several thousand years where this gene intermixing is happening, most likely at certain places at certain times. So that's why these genes are probably so persistent with us, because it's not just one small group. We're probably looking at dozens, if not hundreds of groups over the space of maybe 10, 20,000 years coming over.
Wow. Yeah. Oh, awesome. So interesting. I was going to crack a joke about a balmy sunny afternoon and a Neanderthal and anatomically modern human met, but I'll leave that out, I think.
I mean, their versions of Tinder and Bumble would have been amazing, I'm sure. Like, here's your modern Homo sapien. They have mode 3 technologies, this kind of thing. Here's your Neanderthal. They can do Acheulean and Laval War. What would you like? There is cave paintings by Bob over here. There is other artistic expressions, by Neanderthals over there. Do you prefer mammoth? Do you prefer deer? Swipe left, swipe right.
I was just about to say I was swiping right on that one. That's amazing. Yeah, that's so. We've got a new theory on the origins of cave art immediately. That's another episode already. Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose really then I do want to go into what it would have been like to be a neurodivergent Neanderthal, if we can try and imagine that. But yeah, I think also it's important to get symbolism in there because we missed out on that last time. So I don't know how you want to do it. If you want to just,
let's do symbolism first, because I think this is the big difference between Neanderthals and modern humans. So the context behind Neanderthal symbolism is for years, for centuries, even for a century, the better part of a century, no one believed or no one seriously considered that Neanderthals were a symbolic species. Okay, compared to Homo sapiens, why would you? Homo sapiens, we created the cave art in Lascaux and everything like that. We created Venus figurines and all that kind of stuff. We decorated our caves, our sites, that kind of stuff with pigments and that kind of stuff. Neanderthals, we didn't find that evidence. Okay, we found it and dated it towards certain kind of things for Homo sapiens, but Neanderthals were always lacking, and that was one of the key things. The absence of that evidence convinced people that actually no, they weren't symbolic at all. But the more we've looked, the more we've kind of understood is that actually they were probably very symbolic, okay, but just in maybe a different type than we are, because obviously they are a different human group, for example, and not all human groups have the same kind of symbolic expression that we do. So, for example, in Cueva Anton in Spain, there's a king scallop. Okay, that is decorated. There is perforations around it, which kind of suggests that it was worn. The shell was worn, and it's got this natural red coloration around it on the exterior, and traces of unnatural orange pigmentation on it. So it was painted, for its color, and it was worn for its color, and it's dated to the Neanderthal, times, that kind of stuff. It's not modern human. It's definitely clearly Neanderthal, and here it is. It's done. It's been dated. You have the reconstruction of like the white-tailed eagle talon jewelry from Krapina in Croatia, for example, all maybe worn as personal ornamentation. That kind of stuff going forward. You have the bone flute from Divje Babe, which it's 43,000 years old. It's in Slovenia. It was found in 95. It is definitely it's borderline, but it's more likely on the Neanderthal side than the modern human side. And if it is a flute, it's showing Neanderthal music.
Yeah.
So they may not be making these giant, paintings of bison, of horse, of mammoth, and all that kind of stuff, and saber-tooth cats. They have what seemingly is a more personal adornment symbology, which, think of it, George, that's kind of what you would expect from them. They're in small groups. They're not necessarily communicating beyond breeding and kin exchange with other people. Their symbolism is going to reflect their identity. It's going to reflect them, and therefore it's going to be personal adornment. It's not going to be like, hey, look at this cave painting that I've done, because other than them, who's going to see it? Modern humans have the numbers. They can keep coming back to these cave sites, that kind of thing, and season. Neanderthals maybe not so much. So it's like they paint this, it's gone. Neanderthals gone, but Neanderthals will be wearing this kind of jewelry going forward. They would use it to symbolize who they are, maybe represent visually what their kin is compared to other Neanderthal kin groups, which may adorn themselves ever so slightly differently. And this is reflected also in their stone tools. Like I said before, Karen Rubins looked at their hand axes and the ovates and stuff like that, the shapes of their stone tools, and found that there was distinct shapes within northwestern Europe, around Belgium and France and stuff like that, where you had 3 or 4 distinct shapes, which could represent 3 or 4 distinct Neanderthal groups in that area. And they're representing that and showing people through their tools who they are, showing people through the shells that they wore, the talons that they wore, who they are, through the music that they played, maybe who they are.
Wow. Yeah.
And then people are just like, okay, that's fine. Modern humans did this on a bigger scale. And you're just like, yes, but okay, they did it bigger. Doesn't necessarily they made it better. The issue is that the Neanderthals made it. Therefore, their symbolism shouldn't really be in as much doubt as some people have it. And people look at, well, they didn't make these art forms. They didn't make these drawings. And it's like, okay, but they don't have to make these art drawings. And this is where I think maybe a strong or a stronger argument for Neanderthal neurodiversity can come into it, George, because Neanderthals, there is some evidence of so-called art. So, in Spanish La Pasiaga, you have some red painted dots, discs, lines, and hand stencils on the cave walls. Same in Donna Trinidad as well. They're older than 66,000 years ago. That's at least 20,000 years prior to the arrival of modern humans in that part of Europe. Okay. So they're not painting animals, but they have this abstract art. Okay.
Yeah.
Which is completely different to what we're doing as Homo sapiens.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've also, humans, sapiens, we love to create different types of art as well. So there's nothing saying that. I mean, I know when I'm thinking way back to my uni days when I did a module on Upper Paleolithic cave art, and we talked about mobile art and external art, where there was on the rocks outside the caves and outside on the trees and wherever you could imagine there could be art, and none of that's going to survive. And if the Neanderthals preferred that, then maybe they expressed their genius in ways that didn't survive the archaeological record, and we perhaps wouldn't even necessarily recognize as art.
Exactly. We're looking at Neanderthal symbolism from a very distinct modern Homo sapien bias.
Yeah.
Like, what is art to us? Did the Neanderthals do it? And you're just kind of like, why are we asking that question? Why are we viewing it through that lens? Because they're a different group entirely. It's the kind of colonial equivalent of Europeans going to indigenous Americans and going, you're not civilized, we have civilization because we have religion, we have this and that, and you don't have this, so you are not our civilization, that kind of thing, which is rubbish, because obviously the indigenous Native Americans were civilized. They had their own culture. It was just different to the Christendom that Europeans came from. And it's the same parallel argument that modern humans have. Why should we view Neanderthal art through the prism of our own experiences of art? And over recent years, people have kind of come to that and recognized these abstractions of art, these dots, these hand paintings, these lines, these discs, as not possibly made doodles, but actual representatives of a very distinct Neanderthal art. And that's kind of culminated a little bit in places like Gorham's Cave and Einhornhöhle. So Gorham's Cave is in Gibraltar, dated to around 39,000 years ago. Einhornhöhle is in Germany around 49,000 years ago. So both dated to roughly before modern humans-ish were coming into those areas. And they display engravings on the walls on various artifacts. So, for example, in Einhornhöhle in Germany, there's a giant deer bone which displays distinct engravings on it. And in Gorham's Cave, there is a scratched floor with distinct engravings on it in kind of abstract patterns and all the rest, deep scratches. Okay, and this could be the representation of art going forward, and it's been overlooked by us for X amount of years because we don't view that as others, but it could be. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it is. It very well could be, and deep down, I think there is some kind of maybe abstract artistry involved, but there are other reasons why we could have these engravings on floors, say at Gorham's Cave. They could have laid down an animal hide and were scratching it to remove it, for preservation, that kind of thing. And over time, that's gone on to the rock itself. That's a possible alternate hypothesis other than symbolism. But the fact that these are now cropping up in these different versions, that there are consistent engravings across Eurasia within the Neanderthal time period, suggests that, okay, maybe it's more than just a secondary effect of some other behavior. Maybe it is symbolism.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I mean, so if you're looking at a species that can survive the incredibly difficult, challenging environments and survive it for hundreds of thousands of years, it's a little disservice to them to say they didn't have the imagination to create symbolism, isn't it?
It is. And it's a disservice that boosts up our own species' collective ego. Yeah. Because if we turn around and say, by the way, the Neanderthals were no different than us, they were basically rugby league players who hunted, were in smaller groups, and created their own form of symbolism, then the inevitable question is, what makes us different? And that's the question of prehistoric history for centuries, has been, what makes Homo sapiens different? Why are we here?
Yeah, why are we so special? Yeah.
Why are we so special? And for years it has been, we have been smarter, and that has been proved not to be the case. We are biologically more adaptive, that has been proved not the case. And now it's behaviorally, we are symbolic. No, George, it's being proven that is not the case. And when you remove all of that, you realize, well, what makes us special? And nothing makes us special.
We are all beautiful, unique snowflakes. We are.
You know, and then you have to realize that on an evolutionary perspective, like I said before, like I said in the last recording, we were just lucky. Like I'm not saying that there has been some evolutionary work in Homo sapiens. There clearly has been. You know, stone tools, going into new environments, out competing Neanderthals, agriculture, that kind of stuff. Yet we have done amazing things. But a lot of that has been down to luck, the look of the environment, the look of being in a specific time and place, that kind of thing, you know. And, you know, time, energy has been invested. It is not because we are inherently more intelligent. It is not because we're inherently more symbolic or abstract or anything like that. It is because there's been a right set of conditions, and we've benefited from them. Given another group, you know, we could have been reversed. Given some other kind of conditions, we could be Neanderthals on a podcast talking about our cousins Homo sapiens from Africa and why they suddenly went extinct, you know, that kind of thing. It's just evolutionary look. And I think it's the symbolism, this different form of symbolism, because our tool industries were very similar. Our hunting behaviours were very similar. Our kinship systems seem to be very similar. Our genetics seem to be very similar, okay? And then you have this abstract symbolism, which seems to be ever so slightly different. So if you're looking for neurodiversity, this is where I think you'll find it more solidly. This is where I think you'll find it archaeologically, in these abstractions of imagery going forward. What are they communicating? What do these engravings mean going forward? Because we see engravings in Homo sapiens, yes, but they're more visual in their parietal and more biliary art going forward, you know, Lascaux and all the cave paintings and stuff and the handprints. What does this mean? And I think if we're going to find reason for neurodiversity and what a neurodiverse Neanderthal was, you know, I can't say with certainty, but these abstractions would be, I think, the place to look going forward, and then to compare them with maybe neurodiverse art from contemporary neurodiverse Homo sapiens.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I think that if you're looking for it, you're looking for ingenuity. We see that in stone tools, and I think we say stone tools, that's what survives best. Stone tools all survive. There's so many other perishable tools and so on that haven't survived, that probably would give a better indication of just how incredibly intelligent and creative and industrious these guys were. With the symbolism in art and one of that immediately betrays a desire to create. Okay, so that individual that made those marks on those bones or those dots or those lines, they felt that. They weren't just doing it. They're not avatars. This is why I always found that people would look back into the past as some text or a straight line backwards and some avatars walking around fulfilling this prophecy of what they did back then. But really, everyone was feeling something at that time. Some emotions were involved with it. Their nervous systems were humming when they were making that art. You know,
True, but don't also forget that they're making this art with those emotions, that feeling, that purpose. And you're right, George, it would have had a purpose. Like it would have been tens of thousands of years before human society can make art just for art's sake. Really, that art, even for Homo sapiens, would have had a purpose. That symbolism would have had a purpose. And even on the kind of broad sense of a Neanderthal individual, this more personal art would have reflected maybe their kin, their sense of self, and they would have been making that with all the emotions that you have just said, finding beauty in those materials, those colors, and finding meaning in them, and use them not just to preserve those emotions and feelings maybe, but to communicate to others who they are, just as Homo sapiens did.
The other thing I was just thinking as well is also there's a potential element of soothing involved in expression, not necessarily understood, more abstract. So you've had a rough day. So I imagine myself as a Neanderthal, and I've been out hunting. There's been an injury. There's maybe been a death in the family. Maybe we're very stressed at the time. If we had some luck and things came good, and we got back home and everything's going to be okay tonight. Maybe you've got to process these emotions. So if I'm a neurodiverse Neanderthal, I'm not sort of sitting down going, oh, fantastic, that was a great day, we got what we want, I've got a belly full of food, now I'm going to sleep. I've still got to process all this out of my nervous system. I need to let it go. If there's music, is there storytelling? If there's art, is there acting? How far could it have actually gone?
It again, this, like you said before, a lot of this kind of behavior, because it's non-material, won't be reflected in the archaeological record, but Neanderthals most likely had language. I firm don't believe that they did. Like, how else can you create most of these stone tools, teach these stone tools without some form of vocal language? So if you have this, if you're trying to process, if you're trying to teach these people or individuals or your kin how to create a stone tool, you have some form of a language, some form of a vocalization. You can use that not just to teach, but to tell stories. And those stories might have a lesson in them, of course, but they will allow you to pass on information, to soothe, to reassure, to teach lessons. So your young juvenile Neanderthals are reassured that things can get better. And obviously, we mentioned the bear flute. They could have music. They could be singing. I would be curious as to know what a Neanderthal boy band looked like, but they could have this, they could have been utilizing these musics, these flutes and that kind of thing for their own kind of stuff, all of which would not be, the sounds of which would not be created or stored in the archaeological record. But yeah, were they telling stories? I would, hand on heart, I think they would be. Would they be having conversations amongst themselves in the Neanderthal way? Most definitely. Would they be using that like contemporary hunter-gatherers use it to pass on their belief systems, if they had them, pass on their understanding of the environment, the next day's plans, processing, like you said, the previous day that they've had, mourning the dead, because obviously they buried their dead. That must have been a very significant situation, whether even that was because of just so a decomposing Neanderthal didn't stink up the place, or because this wasn't a very distinct individual, that would have had some emotionality to it, that as that act was being undertaken. And obviously they've got language, unless they experience toxic masculinity, that Homo sapiens experienced toxic masculinity, they would have talked about it, they would have shared that going forward. So yeah, all of this symbolism, all of this communication, I think is there. We just can't prove it unless, like you said, we gun the DeLorean up to 88 miles an hour and go and see what it is. So which takes us all back really, George, to like you that first question. Like, this all gives an idea, I think, what Neanderthal, to you and your listeners, what Neanderthal life would have been like, right? It would have been hard, but it would have had its moments, okay? It's moments of joy when you get a mammoth to eat, and moments of bounty with all that resources. It would have been filled maybe with stories and distinct types of art at various places. It would have been filled with ornamentation that placed you within a kin group, okay, which bound you to these individuals. Could have been filled with music. There would have been times of want, which those kind of materials would have bound even further, because you weren't in it alone. You were in it together with your 10 to 30 other Neanderthal groups. The second part, that's kind of like Neanderthal life as it was, really. The second part of your question was, what would a neurodiverse Neanderthal life look like? And I honestly think it would have looked very similar, but with certain kind of caveats. I think maybe depending on the expression of that neurodiversity, you could have found individuals who would have been at the center of maybe teaching, Levallois and that concept that is very hard for maybe an individual at such an early stage to visualize and grasp. They could have been there to say, look here, they could have been at the forefront of developing those kind of technologies within their stone tools of how they created it. Conversely, they could have been at the forefront of the symbolic technology that helped bind people together to be like, hey, look, I've made these indentations in Gibraltar because this is our space, kind of thing, to reassure that individual that this is their, or part of their home and part of their kin, to create those items that bind everyone together through that kind of behavior. So I kind of think a neurodiverse behavior would have been a typical Neanderthal, like turned up 5 to 10%, that kind of stuff to help bond everyone together and to create a place for it to help reassure the group cohesions and the group success and becoming value to that group.
Absolutely. It sounds like it's another way of putting it is that the circumstances were there for neurodivergent Neanderthals to have very similar roles to what some neurodiverse have had over the last, well, the centuries, the millennia that we know as anatomically modern humans. We just talk about art and storytelling and creativity and ingenuity and all that. The genius that comes from the spectrum has to go somewhere. It needs to be expressed, or it manifests in depression, anxiety, and all sorts of problems. We see that,
and very well, Neanderthals probably suffered from those kind of things, especially in the lean periods. But the expression of Neanderthal society was more likely very, very insular. Yes, they traded with other groups, and yes, we see material exchanges all across Europe of certain stones and stuff like that and raw materials. But on the day-to-day, it would have been very insular. It would have been focused on those 10 to 30 individuals, the familial unit. So it's no surprising that those neurodiverse behaviors were probably geared towards, if they existed, would have geared towards maintaining those bonds. Whereas with Homo sapiens, we're not we're insular, but we also view outwards because we had the population numbers. We needed to communicate with other groups, and we did so more routinely. So our neurodiverse behaviors were probably slightly different to the Neanderthals, where they were insular. Ours could have been going outwards. So our symbolism, our neurodiverse behaviors probably not only affected and bonded us together, but also communicated that and helped bond other Homo sapiens together. And that's why you probably have a large spectrum now of Homo sapien neurodivergent behavior compared to maybe the Neanderthal perspective of it.
Well, I mean, the question that's popped into my head now is not going to be able to answer today. In fact, we're running out of time, but I am conscious of that.
I say again, I can waffle about the Neanderthals for as long as you want.
I know. Honestly, I could listen all day, Andy. It's fantastic. I love this. But the one thing this just popped into my head is, would it be ridiculous to imagine that the Neanderthals gave us, or that side, that particular, so not just Neanderthals from further back, from the older primates and so on, but the autism side of things came down that line, and then the anatomically modern humans came over with ADHD, and we combined in this spectrum. Do you know what I mean?
With your powers combined, I pronounce you neurodiverse. No, it's you know what? The lovely thing about archaeology and prehistoric anthropology, George, as you well know, is that nothing is known for certain, and there is no loss in answering that question or proposing that hypothesis, because we don't know, and the joy is finding that answer. And time will tell, right? The better we understand genetics, the better we understand neurodiverse and neurotypical behavior, both in ourselves and its expression in other human groups like the Neanderthals. The better we understand the interplay of genetics and phenotypic behavioral sequences, the better we can be able to see and look for these clues in the material archaeological record. So yes, it could be, that we could get one from one and another from another, that kind of stuff. It could all be this interplay of genes, that makes us unique in that kind of diverse behavior. And that's the joy of archaeology and prehistoric anthropology in this. It's the joy of understanding who we are, because that's the thing. The more we realize we're not special compared to other human species, the more we realize we're lucky, the better we can focus on who are we as a human species and how did we get here and what can we do going forward? Because, as you know, George, archaeology, we may look at the past, but we learn the lessons of the past to apply it to the future.
Absolutely. That's the beauty of archaeology, isn't it? It's the gift of knowledge, of true understanding, and taking that into everyday life. So it just dispels so many myths and gets rid of so much tension. we don't need to hate each other. We're all the same. We're all, even though we're all different. It's just one big story.
It is. It's one big evolutionary story that has its winners, that has its neutrals, that has its losers, but we're all part of it. We're all under the same influences, the same processes, that kind of stuff. And it's amazing to see not only how far we've come as an African species to dominate our global ecosystem, for better or worse, depending on how you view that, but also how our extended family has evolved. So we've talked about Neanderthals, we've mentioned Ergaster erectus, Heidelbergensis, Antecessor. There's the Denisovans, obviously, more and more known about them each day, but also like some of the African human species, habilis, Naledi, those kind of stuff. We're all evolving and on that kind of spectrum of evolution, those traits of evolution going forward, and some were success, some contributed to our success, some failed. And it is amazing to see that human journey start from, not just our journey, because we weren't the only human, but, from 1 million years ago, was, or more, for Homo habilis and Homo ergaster to now, to see how far we as a genus, as a human group have come, is humbling.
It's also gorgeous. I love it.
It's a big tapestry. I don't think an impressionist could paint a better tapestry of our kind of stuff, right? They'd try, but I don't think they'd scope it. You truly realize the art of, in the broader sense, not the literal sense of the human story, when you can sit down and you can see these 1 million year old hand axes or these incisions absolutely. At 39,000 years ago, or that kind of stuff.
No, they all deserve their moment, don't they? It's a disservice to them to sort of just blanket them all together and say, oh yeah, it was okay. No, it was wonderful. Every significant event, every invention, every creation. And I think it's fair to say that neurodiversity has had a big role in all of that. Of course. Like without
that neurodiversity, we may struggle pointing, examples of it and knowing for sure, but in probably, all high probability, without that neurodiversity, we might not have had the adaptive advantages that we have had. And that goes not just for Homo sapiens, but Neanderthals and other such humans, and maybe even, other mammalian species. We don't, I'm not a geneticist on the mammalian level, but it's all of that kind of stuff. Without that diversity of behavior, neuro or otherwise, we would not be here.
Absolutely. Here. Well, Andy, I do want to ask a load more questions, but we're not going past an hour. I'm not doing it today. So I'm going to cap it at that and just say thank you very, very much for coming back on. I think we can probably say that neurodiversity isn't something that we can claim as our own in the modern world. I think it's something that's been here a long time, and it's probably not something we should get too upset or excited about, but definitely something we can be proud of. So, Andy, the Neanderthals are amazing. That was amazing. Thank you so much, and I hope we can do something like this again, because there's loads more to talk about. Thanks for having me, and call me back anytime. Andy, thanks very much. And everyone else, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode. Bye-bye.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Culturo Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.